Hey guys, tonight we're traveling back to the misty mountain paths and creaky wooden corridors of feudal Japan. Picture yourself standing in a silent courtyard just before sunrise. The sky is still a deep gray blue, the kind that makes shadows stretch long and makes you feel like the world hasn't fully woken up yet. The air is cool and smells faintly of pine ash, steamed rice, and the sharp tang of iron. Somewhere off in the distance, a bamboo flute plays a slow, wandering tune. Here everything feels still, but also tense like the calm before something important. You're not here as a visitor, you're here as a samurai. And unfortunately for your legs, that means one thing: it's time to kneel. Not just any kneel, Caesar. That perfectly proper, painfully precise posture where your knees are tucked under your back, is straight, and your feet are folded beneath your body like a well-behaved pretzel. Within 30 seconds, your ankles go numb. At 2 minutes, your calves are holding an emergency meeting. And by the 5-minute mark, you're having a mild spiritual crisis. You're trying not to move. You're trying not to wince. But wow, you're suddenly very aware of every nerve below the waist. And you know the worst part: you haven't even had breakfast yet. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. So it's always cool to see our sleepy little community across time zones. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're kneeling in the main hall of your lord's estate, where every breath, every blink, and every inch of posture is being silently judged. The tatami mats beneath you look soft, but they lie. They are tightly woven, firm, and about as forgiving as a gym floor wrapped in straw. You're not sitting for comfort, you're sitting for duty. This is not yoga. This is not mindfulness, this is survival. In this culture, the way you sit reflects the kind of person you are. Your poise shows your loyalty. Your stillness shows your strength. Your legs, they are collateral damage. Historians still argue whether the samurai obsession with proper posture came more from Zen Buddhism or from strict codes of etiquette. But either way, once you're trained to endure it, you suffer in silence. There's no casual fidgeting, no stretch it out real quick. You endure because breaking posture isn't just rude, it's disrespectful. It could cost you reputation, or worse, your life. And let's not forget, this is just the beginning of your day. You woke up before dawn, practiced sword drills in the cold, washed in water that could double as ice, and now you're stuck on the floor pretending your legs aren't having a meltdown. If someone brought you a chair right now, you might cry. But chairs don't even exist in this room. Your only company is the soft creak of floorboards, the quiet rustle of robes, and the growing pins and needles sensation in your feet that feels oddly personal. But still you sit, because status is pain, because honor requires it, and because somewhere along the line, sitting down in agony became the ultimate power move. Eventually the meeting ends. A polite bow, a whispered farewell, a gentle sliding of doors. You're finally allowed to stand, but now your legs have ghosted you. You try to rise smoothly like a composed warrior, but your knees crack like twigs and your foot has forgotten how to be a foot. For a terrifying moment, you nearly tip forward like a falling statue. No one says anything, but you catch the briefest flicker of amusement in the servant's eyes. That was the samurai version of a roast. You limp away with your pride mostly intact, but your thighs are questioning their life choices. And the truth is, you'll be back on the floor soon enough. Because being a samurai wasn't just about fighting, it was about appearance. Which brings us to a major problem: the armor. Samurai armor is beautiful truly. The oyuroi set is like wearing a sculpture. It's a mix of iron and lacquered leather plates, silk cords laced with geometric perfection, and enough layers to make you feel like a walking museum exhibit. But this armor wasn't made for relaxing. It was made for war. And unfortunately, the human body isn't really designed to fold into polite floor-sitting positions while encased in a portable tank. The moment you lower yourself into Caesar with armor on your entire body goes into negotiation mode. The chest plate jams into your lap, the shoulder guards splay out like mini wings. And the moment you try to bow, you realize your helmet has turned your neck into a locked hinge. Suddenly, you're less noble warrior and more crumpled beetle in a box. Historians still debate how often samurai actually wore their full armor outside of battle. Some believe it was reserved for formal events or shows of power, while others argue that high-ranking retainers often wore partial armor as a symbol of status. Either way, it didn't make sitting any easier. There's even a 17th century diary entry from a castle servant describing how a samurai had to call in 2 assistants just to get the front of his armor loosened enough to eat rice. That's not a lunch break, that's a tactical operation. Chairs again would have solved this problem. But no. Feudal Japan collectively decided chairs were suspiciously Western and instead opted for the lifelong challenge of squatting stylishly. And if you thought stairs were hard, now try them in armor. Castles were designed to slow enemies down. That meant narrow steps, low ceilings, sudden turns, basically a nightmare obstacle course for anyone dressed like a weaponized bookshelf. You'd reach the audience chamber winded and sore, and then be expected to kneel politely as if you hadn't just completed the Iron Samurai obstacle run. TM. No water, no massage, just floor. By now you understand why the most heroic samurai statues show them standing or riding horses. Rarely sitting, and definitely never relaxing. They weren't against sitting. Sitting just wasn't designed to work for them. Not with all that gear. Not with all those expectations, and not with all those watching eyes waiting to see if you twitch, slouch, or sigh. Posture in this world isn't a suggestion, it's a statement. Sitting in stillness while your body screams is considered a virtue. Slouching, meanwhile, is a subtle sign that your soul might be slipping. No pressure, so you learn to keep still, to balance the unbearable weight of metal fabric and pride on your aching frame, and do it without blinking. Because in the life of a samurai, discomfort is discipline. And sitting isn't rest, it's performance. Of course, even when you're not armored like a walking chest of drawers, sitting in Japan comes with its own ancient set of rules. See, in feudal Japan, there wasn't just a way to sit, there were entire sitting styles, and each came with its own meaning, hierarchy, and potential for social disaster. The most infamous Seiza. Yes, the one you're still recovering from. This was the correct way to sit, knees together, back straight, feet tucked neatly underneath you, like some kind of origami swan made of flesh and pain. It looked elegant. It symbolized discipline. But it also cut off circulation faster than a bad tourniquet. Here's the thing, Seiza wasn't even all that traditional until the Edo period. Historians still argue whether it was standardized more for the sake of uniformity or evolved from samurai military discipline being absorbed into polite society. Some even claim it was a political tool, a kind of silent control that filtered into every level of Japanese life. After all, it's very hard to rebel when your legs are asleep. But once it took root, Seiza became the golden standard, especially among the samurai class. And for them, sitting improperly wasn't just rude, it was rebellious, a potential challenge, a statement that could end in a duel, or worse, a stern letter from someone with better posture. Let's say you're at a formal gathering. You enter the room, carefully remove your sandals, step onto the tatami mat, and kneel into Seiza. Around you, everyone else is perfectly poised silently, judging whether your heels are correctly aligned or your knees are too far apart. One wrong shift and someone might think you're being casual. And casual in a room full of people with swords is dangerous. Now imagine doing that for hours. Ceremonies, meetings, strategy discussions. Most of them involved a lot of sitting. But it wasn't meditative. It was performative, a test of endurance, and let's not pretend like your body got used to it. There are accounts of warriors, nobles, and monks alike having to discreetly shift their weight or subtly shake out their legs when no one was watching. Because yes, even the Stoic masters got pins and needles. They just hit it better. And in case you were wondering, no, there wasn't much padding involved. Maybe a thin zabuton pillow if you were lucky, but that was more of a symbolic cushion than an actual comfort device. Think of it like putting a single tissue on a bench and calling it a mattress. Meanwhile, your legs are slowly transforming into stone sculptures of themselves. But there was also agura, the cross-legged style more often used by monks, artists, or folks of lower status. It was looser, more grounded. But for samurai, that was usually off limits, unless you were in a casual setting, or maybe drunk, or both. The message was clear. Agora was what you sat in when you could afford not to care. Seiza was what you endured when your reputation was on the line. Even how you got up mattered. You didn't just stand, you uncurled. You transitioned. You floated upward like a cherry blossom on a spring breeze, ignoring the fact that your right foot had completely stopped working and your left knee was staging a coup. Why? Because every movement was being read like a sentence. Were you patient? Were you strong? Were you disciplined, or heaven forbid, were you just an ordinary guy who wanted to not sit like a folded lawn chair for once? In the world of samurai, there were no shortcuts, not even in how you sat. And just when you think it couldn't get any more complicated, you remember the swords. Ah, yes, the katana and wakizashi, the paired blades that were as much a part of your body as your arms and legs. You wore them every day, all day. They weren't just weapons. They were status identity, even a spiritual extension of your soul. But there was one major problem they made sitting down even worse. Imagine walking into a room with two swords at your hip. You can't just plop down like you're sliding into a booth at a diner. There's a ritual to it, a geometry, a silent negotiation with the space around you. You remove the swords before sitting carefully, placing them on your right side, unless you're trying to signal trust, in which case they go on your left. Or maybe it was the other way around. Historians still debate the nuance. What's clear is that everyone in the room was watching where and how you placed them. And if you got it wrong, well, that could be interpreted as a threat. Seriously. Lay your sword with the hilt facing the wrong direction, and you might be signaling that you're ready to draw. It's like flipping someone off in slow motion, but with steel involved. So naturally, the act of sitting wasn't just about your posture, it became a chess move. Your knees ached, your back burned, and now you were also playing social politics with your weapons. Relaxing, right? Of course, the room itself didn't help. Traditional Japanese architecture was gorgeous, wide open spaces, soft lighting, the faint scent of sandalwood in the air. But it was also unforgiving. There were no chairs, no backs to lean against, nothing but flat surfaces and social pressure. You'd think someone would invent a bench out of sheer necessity. But no, you sat on the floor like your ancestors did. And because the samurai class prided itself on tradition, innovation was discouraged. Comfort was for other people, possibly foreigners. And the irony, you had to carry those swords everywhere but rarely use them. Most samurai lived in relatively peaceful times, especially during the Edo period, but they still had to maintain the illusion of readiness, like a soccer goalie standing in the net during a game where no one's shooting. That constant tension seeped into everything, even how they sat. You couldn't sprawl out or lean back without looking lazy. You had to stay poised, present, alert, as if a duel might break out over the rice being slightly undercooked. There's a famous anecdote, one of those passed down stories that may or may not be true, about a samurai who was so rigid about his sitting etiquette that he refused to shift positions, even as a spider slowly descended onto his face during a meeting. He just sat there, motionless, stoic, possibly traumatized. But hey, that's the price of honor. And if that sounds ridiculous, consider this: a slight flinch, a nervous fidget, or a glance in the wrong direction could be interpreted as weakness. And in a society where strength and control defined your social worth, even a minor lapse in posture could start rumors. People noticed, and people talked. So you learned to sit like a sculpture. You learned to place your swords like statements. And every movement, no matter how small, was choreographed like a performance. Because in the samurai world, stillness wasn't just silence, it was strategy. You'd think by now that the worst of it would be behind you. You've mastered the posture, survived the armor, even figured out where to place your swords without accidentally challenging your host to a duel. But there's another reason samurai never really liked sitting down: because they were never truly off the clock, not even for a moment. You, my friend, are always on. Every glance, every breath, every hand placement is part of the role. Even when you're resting, you're meant to radiate alertness. And it's exhausting. You're like a security camera that never blinks. The truth is, being a samurai meant constantly performing a strange ballet of politeness and readiness. You sit on the floor with perfect form, but your brain is scanning every doorway. You bow with grace, but your fingers are already gauging the distance to your blade. You appear calm, but your entire body is coiled like a spring, because the rules might change at any moment. The term for this is zanshin, a concept in Japanese martial arts that means remaining mind or lingering awareness. It's the idea that your attention never fully drops, even in moments of apparent stillness. It's like your nervous system is on a dimmer switch, but it never actually turns off. Zanshin turns posture into preparedness. And guess what posture was the best for that constant state of awareness? You guessed it, standing. Not only does standing let you move quickly, it also keeps you out of the social minefield that is formal sitting. That's why in many daily scenarios, samurai preferred to stand if they had the option. Watching over a gate stand, escorting your lord stand, attending a tea ceremony. Okay, fine, you have to kneel, but you're internally dreaming of standing. Because when you're standing, your body's aligned, your muscles aren't cramping, and you can actually breathe like a person instead of a polite statue. Even in downtime, like during poetry readings or strategy sessions, many samurai found ways to lean, subtly stretch discreetly, or simply remain standing under the guise of being alert. The idea of full relaxation, slouching, sprawling, sighing was reserved for people without swords strapped to their waist. And even then, you better not do it in public. Historians point out that this constant tension was partly cultural and partly practical. Samurai, after all, lived in a time when grudges could be deadly. A perceived insult might lead to a duel. A surprise attack wasn't some abstract worry, it was a real, deeply historical possibility. The Edo period may have brought relative peace, but the mindset of readiness remained. Better to be sore and upright than surprised and dead. And honestly, you start to feel it. The way your shoulders instinctively stay squared. The way you move like you're trying not to disturb the air around you. The way you kneel and rise like it's all choreographed in a slow, ancient dance. You aren't just obeying tradition, you're protecting yourself. Because sitting down means vulnerability. It means you can't reach your weapon as fast. It means your spine is exposed, your knees are occupied, and your blood flow is slowly staging a coup. Standing, that's freedom. That's strategy. That's the difference between control and chaos in a world where either could happen over a misplaced bow. And so you stay alert. You keep standing a little longer than necessary. You tell yourself it's about honor, tradition, discipline. But let's be real, it's also about not having to go numb in the legs again. Because the real samurai secret, they didn't hate sitting because they were tough. They hated it because they were smart. You haven't truly suffered until you've endured the Japanese tea ceremony while locked in sisa for an hour. At first glance, the whole event seems peaceful, almost meditative, quiet movements, graceful gestures, a beautifully minimal room with soft natural light and maybe the distant trickle of a stone water basin outside. But then you remember you're sitting again, and this time you're not allowed to move at all. Not even a toe twitch. The chinoyu, or traditional tea ceremony, was the pinnacle of formality. For the samurai, it wasn't just about sipping matcha and watching someone whisk hot water in slow motion. It was a full-blown ritual of restraint. Everything had meaning. The folding of the napkin, the angle of the bow, the precise way the tea bowl was turned in your hands. And all of this took place while you knelt in seiza, trying to look serene, while your feet quietly begged for mercy. You can't just fake it either. The host and guests are constantly watching each other, reading body language for signs of awareness and grace. A stray cough, a wobble, a soft grunt as your ankle goes numb. That's a no-no. You're supposed to be a rock. A refined, elegant, fully present rock. One that's slowly dying inside, but with dignity. There are records from Edo period writings where samurai politely excused themselves mid-ceremony because they couldn't physically take it anymore. The irony, of course, is that the whole point of the ceremony was to instill calm focus and harmony. Historians still debate whether the samurai really enjoyed the tea ceremony or simply endured it as another layer of discipline. It's entirely possible they appreciated the spiritual aspect while quietly praying for the session to wrap up before they passed out from foot paralysis. And just to make things more fun, your swords weren't welcome in the tea room. You had to leave them at the entrance, a tradition meant to symbolize trust and vulnerability, which sounds poetic until you realize you're sitting on the floor, half paralyzed, unarmed, and surrounded by other warriors with strong opinions about matcha temperature. Sounds peaceful, right? And if you think modern yoga classes are strict, try being corrected in a tea ceremony by someone who outranks you and is saying everything in poetic metaphors. You don't just sit wrong, you've disrupted the tranquility of the flow, you haven't spilled water, you've tilted the harmony of space, and you better believe your ancestors are silently judging you for it. But beneath the elegance, there's also a quiet strength. The samurai didn't practice tea ceremony just for leisure. It was a kind of soft training, a chance to practice self-control, humility, and razor-sharp presence. Because if you can hold your posture while your legs turn into boiled bamboo shoots, you can probably keep your composure in a sword fight, right? Still, even the most poetic of warriors had to admit once the final bow was done and the tea bowl was passed one last time, the relief of slowly standing up, of feeling the blood rush back to your toes was almost spiritual. That subtle ache, that pins and needles rush like your foot is being born again, that was its own form of enlightenment, because nothing teaches mindfulness quite like the agony of stillness. And so the tea ceremony ends. You bow one last time, you rise slowly, pretending not to wobble, and step into your sandals like a monk exiting a sacred trance. You survived. You sat. You endured. But the second you turn the corner and no one's looking, you stretch your legs like a toddler after a nap. And for just a moment, it feels like freedom. Let's rewind the clock a little back to when you were still a kid, an aspiring samurai with a top knot that barely stayed in place, and a wooden sword that felt much heavier than it looked. Life in the samurai class didn't exactly ease you in. From the moment you could stand upright without falling over, your training began. Sword drills, calligraphy, moral lessons, etiquette classes, and of course, sitting lessons. Yes, actual lessons on how to sit. Because apparently sitting was so important, it needed a curriculum. You'd be told to kneel in seiza, hold your posture, breathe quietly and not complain. And you'd do this for as long as your instructors decided was necessary, sometimes 15 minutes, sometimes hours. You were 7 years old and your legs were already being trained to go numb with honor. The worst part, you weren't even allowed to cry. If you winced, you were weak. If you shifted, you were undisciplined. If you collapsed sideways in a heap of twitching limbs, well, that happened more than once. But no one helped you. You were expected to learn the hard way by failing silently and repeatedly. It wasn't just about tradition, it was about building tolerance. Learning to suffer quietly was considered a virtue. You were told stories of legendary samurai who could sit through snowstorms, heat waves, and lectures from elderly nobles without moving a muscle. Whether those stories were true is still debated by historians, but the message was clear. A real samurai doesn't just fight with a sword, they master their body's rebellion 1 minute of quiet agony at a time. And your teachers didn't go easy on you. They'd walk the room while you knelt, adjusting shoulders here, tapping backs there, whispering things like straighten your spine, or don't fidget, in that soft, terrifying voice of someone who clearly means business. Occasionally someone would pass out. It wasn't a scandal, it was expected. That's how you knew you were learning. Sometimes you were even expected to meditate in seiza. Not just sit, meditate. Clear your mind, focus on your breath, and ignore the slow burning fire crawling through your knees. Zen monks would sit for hours like this, unmoving eyes, half-open hands, forming the same exact mudra they had yesterday and the day before. And if the monks could do it, then you, child of the warrior elite, had no excuse. Of course, meditation didn't always come with inner peace. Most of the time it came with cramps. But over time you got used to the rhythm. You learned to anticipate the pain, to settle into it, to treat it like background noise instead of a crisis. That numbness, it became familiar. That ache, almost comforting. Like a strange reminder that you were doing something hard and doing it right. Eventually you'd graduate from the basic drills and begin to understand the deeper lesson. Sitting wasn't just sitting. It was control, mental, emotional, physical. It was about presenting a version of yourself that looked calm even when your entire lower body was screaming. It was about showing the world and yourself that you could hold the line, even if that line was your own spine. By the time you were a teenager, sitting still had become second nature. You'd kneel without thinking. You'd hold posture automatically. And when your younger cousin collapsed during his first sitting lesson, you didn't laugh. You just handed him some advice. Don't think about your legs, think about the wall. Because that's what endurance looked like. Stoicism, silence, and a slow mastery of discomfort. And maybe that was the point. Now let's say you've grown up, completed your training, and earned your place as a full-fledged samurai. You've memorized the rituals, perfected your sword technique, endured countless hours of kneeling until your legs might as well be made of rice paste, and yet one basic truth still haunts you. Sitting down is a tactical liability. Sure, it's elegant. Sure, it's expected. But if someone bursts into the room right now with a blade drawn and you're locked in seiza, you're basically a well-dressed, immobilized target. This is why so many samurai, when given the option, preferred standing or at least perching lightly half-seated, ready to launch themselves up in an instant. Because once you're deep in formal sitting posture, it's a process to get up. Not a graceful fluid leap into action like in the movies. No more like a desperate wobble, maybe a roll onto one hip, one foot sliding forward awkwardly, the whole motion resembling a nervous crane trying to take flight in a narrow hallway. Not exactly combat ready, and everyone knew it. That's why formal settings like courtrooms or strategy meetings, any place where high-ranking samurai gathered, were not just about honor and elegance. They were also about unspoken risk. You knew exactly where everyone's sword was, who had their hand near it, and who was already planning their next move just in case things went sideways. Even in the most refined settings, there was always a hint of tension beneath the surface. You weren't just guests. You were potential threats waiting for an excuse. Historians often point out that Caesar served a dual purpose. It was both an act of respect and a physical restraint. By requiring guests to kneel, a host subtly diminished their mobility. Less chance of an impulsive duel, less likelihood of someone springing into action. More psychological control, all under the polite cover of tradition. And then there were the architectural traps. The rooms were often small, the doorways low, and the exits placed behind the host. In Caesar, you couldn't see who was entering behind you. That meant sitting in that position didn't just make you slower, it made you vulnerable from every angle. Of course, if you were the one hosting this, worked in your favor. The power dynamic was built into the floor plan. But that didn't mean you liked it. You just accepted it. Because as a samurai, you were trained to be ready for anything, even if you had to leap into battle with one numb leg and the other still folded under you like a forgotten beach chair. There's even an old story, possibly exaggerated over the centuries, of a duel that started mid-tea ceremony. One samurai insulted another by accusing him of placing his sword on the wrong side of the mat. Within seconds, they were both up and trying to draw their blades while still tangled in the fabric of their own legs. The duel ended with one man standing and the other still trying to find his balance. The lesson: never underestimate the power of posture. And you felt that truth in your bones. Literally. Sitting too long in Caesar didn't just hurt, it left you slower, stiffer, and far less lethal. It was a position of peace, but one that always carried the tension of war. You might be pouring tea, reciting poetry, or discussing grain tax policy, but somewhere in your mind you were always counting the steps it would take to stand and strike. Because sitting down for a samurai wasn't about comfort. It was about being ready to move, even when you couldn't. And so standing became a kind of quiet rebellion. Not loud, not rude, just preferred. You'd find ways to do it subtly. During conversations, you'd lean near a post. While traveling, you'd offer to stand guard while the others rested. Even during casual gatherings, you'd be the one to step aside and observe from a respectful distance, which, let's be honest, was samurai speak for my legs need a break from Caesar. But there was also strategy in it. Standing meant you were alert. It told others, I'm not just here for the poetry. I'm here in case something happens. That mindset crept into every part of samurai life. It wasn't just about being polite or proper, it was about preparedness. You stood near the door, not because you were antisocial, but because the door was your exit and your first line of defense. You stood on watch for your lord, not just as duty, but because it gave you the edge and unobstructed field of vision, free arms, full range of motion. The guy sitting in a corner trying to feel his feet again. He wasn't jumping into action anytime soon. Even off the battlefield, standing gave you psychological advantage. Ever notice how authority figures in samurai dramas always seem to be the ones standing while everyone else kneels? That wasn't just cinematic flair, it was true to historical etiquette. Standing put you in a position of power. You were physically above others. You could speak, observe, and move freely while the kneeling party was quite literally beneath you. The message was clear: I am in control. You are not. This dynamic even played out in moments of peace. Samurai were often expected to act as enforcers or mediators in village disputes, which meant showing up and being imposing, but without drawing a weapon. Standing tall, silent, and still, that was the weapon. You didn't have to threaten anyone. You just had to be upright, preferably in silhouette with the sun at your back. And there was another reason samurai favored standing when possible: the element of surprise. Drawing a sword from seiza was technically possible. It's called iaijutsu, and it's an entire martial art built around drawing and striking in one fluid movement. But here's the thing, it's hard, like really hard. It takes years of practice to not stab yourself in the thigh or whack your own knee, and even when done perfectly, it's still slower than drawing while standing. Historians point out that many samurai kept one knee slightly raised, even while kneeling, subtly shifting their posture to gain an edge without being obvious about it. That little trick made a big difference in the event of a surprise attack. It gave you just enough leverage to move faster than the guy next to you who was fully folded like a human paper crane. It's kind of like how modern athletes keep their weight on the balls of their feet. You're always loaded, always ready, always one movement away from action. Even when sitting, the samurai never really sat. They perched, balanced, calculated. And if they had to sit fully, it was a temporary condition, a performance for tradition's sake, never for ease. Because while samurai honored the ritual of sitting, they secretly longed to be on their feet. Because standing meant survival. But standing wasn't just about readiness in ceremonies or poetry readings, it was essential on the battlefield too. And not just in the duel at dawn sense. You had to be able to fight, yes, but you also had to ride. Because as a samurai, much of your military life revolved around the saddle. Horses weren't just status symbols, they were mobile platforms for archery swordsmanship, and let's be honest, looking dramatically windswept during inspections. The mounted samurai was a striking figure. Clad in armor bows slung across the back, two swords tucked at the waist, it's an iconic image. But here's what you never think about getting off that horse, or worse, getting back on. Samurai saddles were high-backed, steep-seated affairs made of wood, not exactly designed for casual mounting and dismounting. There were no stirrup steps, no assistance waiting with a polite boost. You had to swing your leg up and over while wearing 40 pounds of lacquered armor. And if you did manage to get down without falling on your face, the last thing your body wanted to do was sit again. So you stood, a lot. On long marches, samurai alternated between riding and walking. But during strategic halts or camp setup, most preferred to remain on their feet, pacing, stretching, or leaning on their spears rather than collapsing into any kind of seated position. Why? Because once you sat, it took effort to stand. And effort costs time. And time on a battlefield could be fatal. Even off the field, standing gave you an advantage. Scouts, messengers, and bodyguards often remained upright for hours, positioned just behind a seated lord, never shifting, never relaxing. Think of them as medieval Secret Service agents, but with more swords and less earpiece. These roles required constant focus. Your eyes had to sweep the environment, your hand had to rest lightly on the hilt, your posture had to convey both calm and potential violence. And the best part, you were silently respected for not sitting down. There's even a saying that floated around among the warrior class, roughly translating to a man's strength leaks through his knees. The idea being if you kneel too long, you weaken. And not just physically, it was a metaphor for losing edge, alertness, dignity. Now, scholars still debate whether this saying was truly common or just cherry-picked by modern romantics, but the sentiment holds. Standing wasn't just practical, it was philosophical. And then there were the spies. Yes, the samurai class had its own version of espionage agents. Think of them as proto-special forces, masters of disguise, stealth, and intelligence gathering. Some were technically samurai, others not, but all understood one thing. Sitting makes you slower. If you're lurking in the rafters of a rival estate or slipping through the shadows at night, you don't want to be figuring out how to unfold yourself from Caesar mid-escape. You need to crouch, spring move. Standing or squatting was the natural position of secrecy. It's also worth noting that in popular culture today, samurai are often shown in deep meditation, kneeling silently for hours. And while there's truth to that image in specific religious or ceremonial contexts, it leaves out the broader truth in real life. Most samurai would rather be up and moving. Standing was flexibility. Standing was presence. Standing gave you the full use of your limbs, and in a class where limbs were often lost in combat, that was something to appreciate. So yes, they could kneel with elegance. Yes, they could sit with honor. But ask any real samurai if you could stand, you should. Because stillness looked refined. But standing meant you lived to fight another day. And when they weren't in armor, riding a horse or silently scanning a room for threats, the samurai had one other place where their relationship with sitting got even weirder: bedtime. Or what passed for bedtime in feudal Japan. Because after a long day of kneeling, standing, marching, and generally being a pillar of poise, you'd think maybe a samurai could finally lie down and get some real rest. But no, even sleep came with a side of discomfort. Let's start with the pillow, or rather the takamakura. It's not the kind of pillow you're picturing. No fluffy down, no memory foam, no supportive cloud gently cradling your head. Nope. The traditional samurai pillow was more like a wooden stand, a block basically with a gently curved top to support the neck. Sometimes there'd be a thin fabric-wrapped cushion placed on it, but that was about as soft as putting a folded washcloth over a cinder block. Sweet dreams, warrior? Why would anyone choose this well appearance mattered even in sleep? Samurai wore their hair in top knots meticulously shaped and styled to reflect status and discipline. The takamakura kept the hair elevated while sleeping, preserving the style. Ruin your top knot and you might as well start the day with dishonor and a bad hair day. So you made do. You trained your neck to rest on something that felt like it belonged in a toolbox, and you learned to sleep as stiffly as you sat. Historians still debate whether everyone used these pillows every night, or if they were mostly reserved for travel or formal occasions. But we know they existed, and we know samurai were encouraged to lie flat on their backs, hands resting over the stomach legs together, like you were practicing to be a statue at your own funeral. Peaceful, maybe. Comfortable, absolutely not. The beds themselves weren't really beds either. Most people samurai included slept on woven straw mats laid directly on the floor. During colder months, you might layer extra cloth or share body heat with others in the household, but there was no real mattress. You could try adjusting your posture to relieve pressure points, but with a wooden neck block and a lifetime of sword-ready awareness baked into your muscle memory, the best you'd get was a light doze, interrupted by shoulder cramps. Of course, this wasn't unique to samurai. Most of feudal Japan had a pretty Spartan approach to sleep, but samurai were expected to be ready at all times, even in the middle of the night. A noise outside, you're up. A call from your lord, you're dressed in 30 seconds. There are even accounts of samurai who slept in partial armor while on duty, a practice that sounds just as uncomfortable as it is impractical. But hey, priorities. You start to realize that rest, like everything else in this world, wasn't about comfort, it was about control. Even when sleeping, you didn't let your body collapse. You didn't snore, sprawl, or drool. You maintained form. The battlefield might be miles away, but the expectations were always in the room with you. And maybe that's the real insight. It wasn't that samurai couldn't rest. It's that their definition of rest was built on tension. Stillness, yes. Quiet, definitely. But never surrender, not even to sleep. You lay straight. You stayed composed. You used a wooden block as a pillow and somehow woke up more disciplined than when you went to bed. Because in a world where everything is a test, posture, politeness, preparedness, true rest isn't softness. It's discipline disguised as peace. So here's the funny twist in all of this. While the samurai class was basically inventing advanced techniques for suffering in silence, on flat surfaces, Japan's farmers and laborers, people with no swords, no armor, and no top knots to protect, were out there sitting however they wanted, squatting cross-legged, leaning against things, lounging under trees. Absolute chaos. Beautiful, comfortable chaos. You see, peasants weren't bound by the same rigid social codes. They weren't expected to maintain perfect posture in front of a lord or hold seiza through a tea ceremony while their feet slowly turned into lifeless radishes. Their lives were hard in other ways, of course, long hours harsh. Whether little rest, but when they sat down, they sat. Not to perform, not to impress, just to take the weight off. One of the most common positions was the deep squat, often called the Asian squat today. Feet flat on the ground, knees bent rear, hovering inches above the dirt. It looks like it takes balance, and it does, but it's surprisingly restful if your body's used to it. And unlike seiza, it doesn't cut off your circulation or turn your legs into meat popsicles. Farmers squatted in the fields to eat, to rest, even to chat with neighbors. You could call it the people's posture. No ceremony, no shame. Historians still debate how much this contrast shaped the cultural tension between classes, how much posture became a visual shorthand for identity. A nobleman in seiza was expected to be stoic, a farmer in a squat practical, grounded literally. And because samurai were always trying to maintain their elite image, mimicking the posture of commoners wasn't just discouraged, it was borderline scandalous. There's even some evidence that certain posture rules were deliberately reinforced because of this divide. To sit like a commoner was to step outside your class. And for a society built on hierarchy, that simply wasn't acceptable. So samurai doubled down. They made sitting a skill, a discipline, a kind of badge of honor carved into their kneecaps. Of course, in private things may have loosened up. You'd have to imagine that even the most hardened warrior occasionally slipped into a squat behind closed doors, maybe to eat some rice in peace or rub feeling back into their toes. But publicly, you played the part, even if that part came with joint pain and lifelong sciatica. There's a quiet irony to it all. The warrior class, with its power and prestige, spent half its time enduring a seating ritual designed by centuries of tradition. The people with no status, they just sat however made sense. If you're starting to wonder who really had the better deal, well, you wouldn't be the first. And let's be honest, if someone handed you a choice between Caesar on a bamboo mat or a soft squat under a plum tree with a rice ball in hand, you'd probably choose the plum tree. No one watching, no rules, just gravity doing its job, and your knees for once not plotting your downfall. Because at the end of the day, the samurai's way of sitting wasn't about comfort. It was about control, status, symbolism. The peasants. They didn't have time for symbolism. They had lunch to eat, tools to sharpen, fields to plow. They weren't worried about looking graceful while doing it. They just needed a break that didn't feel like punishment. And you know what? That sounds like wisdom. And then we arrive at the philosophical heart of it all, Zen. If Seiza was the physical embodiment of samurai discipline, then Zen Buddhism was its spiritual engine. From the 12th century onward, Zen had a powerful influence on samurai culture, not just in battle strategy or meditation, but in everyday behaviors, including, of course, the art of sitting. Because nothing says peaceful mind quite like sitting on a cold floor for hours while your legs stage a rebellion and your spine whispers rude things to your brain. Zen practice emphasized stillness, simplicity, focused breathing. But it wasn't the cozy candlelit kind of mindfulness you find in a spa today. This was strict, minimalist. You'd sit in zazen, the Zen form of meditation, back ramrod straight knees, folded in tight hands in a specific mudra, eyes half lidded and gazing downward. The goal wasn't to relax, it was to observe your thoughts without getting attached. To exist in stillness and silence, even as your body began sending subtle signals of distress, or not so subtle ones. And the floor is almost always hard. Tatami wood, maybe a thin cushion if the abbot was feeling generous. No soft lighting, no wind chimes, just the sound of breath, the occasional rustle of robes, and the overwhelming presence of you sitting perfectly still while the universe unfolds, and your left foot goes completely numb. Zen monasteries often train samurai not only in meditation, but in philosophy. The idea was to prepare them for death, for discomfort, and for the unpredictability of life. If you could master your mind in silence, then perhaps you could master your blade in chaos. It was a beautiful idea. Painful, but beautiful. And it aligned perfectly with the samurai code: embrace suffering, embody discipline, and always stay present no matter how much you want to stretch your legs and scream into the tatami. Historians still discuss whether Zen meditation made samurai more effective warriors, or if it simply gave them a socially acceptable way to sit in agony for longer than anyone else. Either way, the overlap stuck. Samurai who trained in Zen often returned to their roles with a newfound stiffness, both physically and spiritually. There are records of warriors who meditated every morning before polishing their armor, others who recited sutras before battle, and of course, some who took pride in being able to sit for hours motionless, like a stone statue sculpted by honor and lower back pain. It didn't stop at sitting either. Zen influenced the way samurai approached everything from tea ceremonies to sword maintenance to calligraphy. Precision, patience, and posture were all reflections of the same internal state. If your body was disordered, your mind was too. So you sat straight, not because it was fun, but because it was necessary. Because discipline wasn't just how you behaved, it was who you were. But let's be clear, Zen didn't make sitting easier. It just gave it meaning. Your legs still went numb. Your shoulders still locked. You still had to resist the urge to fidget or glance around, or mentally compose a haiku about how badly you wanted a chair. But with Zen, all of that discomfort became part of the practice. The pain wasn't an enemy, it was a teacher. And so you endured, you breathed in, breathed out, tried not to shift, tried not to think, Tried not to remember how good it feels to flop onto a futon and let gravity do the work. Because in the world of samurai, Zen comfort was never the goal. Awareness was. Eventually, though, everything starts to change. Even the samurai, those poster children for tradition and stoicism, couldn't keep sitting like statues forever. As Japan moved into the late Edo period and flirted with modernization, a curious thing began to happen. Chairs arrived, Western chairs, with backs and legs and padding. The kind of contraptions that said, hey, what if sitting didn't have to feel like punishment? At first they were viewed with suspicion. Foreigners brought them along with other strange customs forks, leather shoes, pianos. And at the heart of samurai culture was an instinctive resistance to that kind of change. But the chairs, they lingered. One or two started popping up in elite households. Dutch traders, European diplomats, and even a few curious nobles began to embrace them, not as replacements, but as novelties, conversation pieces, exotic indulgences. Historians note that by the mid-19th century, it wasn't uncommon to find a samurai writing official documents while seated in a Western-style chair at a low table. Was it awkward? Probably. Was it comfortable? Definitely. And little by little, that comfort began to win. The Meiji Restoration kicked the door open in the late 1800s. Japan leapt into rapid modernization trains. Telegraphs, school systems, military reform, and chairs came with the package. The government actively encouraged Western habits in dress furniture and architecture. Samurai were no longer expected to kneel in full regalia to display loyalty. They were expected to manage land reforms and write policy. And let's be real, you can't do that well when your feet are asleep. In fact, some older samurai lamented this shift. They saw chairs not just as furniture, but as symbols of a softer world. One where status wasn't marked by how long you could kneel without flinching, but by how quickly you could adapt. And some didn't like that. They missed the rituals, the postures, the slow dignity of a well-timed seiza. Others, though quietly ecstatic. There are even letters from that era where former samurai describe the joy of being able to read or write for hours without needing to uncramp their toes every 10 minutes. One man reportedly called his Western-style chair a gift from the heavens, while another admitted rather sheepishly that he now understood why peasants had always squatted in the dirt. It works, he wrote. I hate that it works. So yes, chairs eventually won. Slowly then suddenly, Japan began to sit higher, and the samurai who remained transitioned from warriors to bureaucrats, educators, even businessmen. The sword was sheathed, the armor stored, and the zabuton quietly slid under desks, replaced by leatherback symbols of the New World Order. It wasn't just furniture, it was evolution. The act of sitting had changed. No longer a symbol of submission or suffering, it was now a tool of productivity. Posture still mattered, but no one expected you to kneel until your legs stopped working. In a strange twist of fate, the samurai, those masters of immobility, finally got to relax a little. Not because tradition said so, but because time had moved on. And maybe when no one was looking, one of them leaned back, sighed and thought, this is nice. And now we arrive at the final chapter in our long journey through stiff, knees-armored creaks and the art of quiet suffering. Retirement. Because even samurai, for all their edge and honor and discipline, eventually got old. The joints wore down, the sword arm got slower, and sitting, yes, sitting became something entirely different. In the later years of life, retired samurai were often granted the rare privilege of stepping away from all that rigidity. They handed off their duties to younger generations and settled into quieter lives. Some became teachers, others took religious vows. A few retreated into poetry gardening or long, meandering walks through the countryside. And guess what? When no one was around to impress, they finally got to sit however they wanted. We're talking legs stretched out in the sun, leaning against tree trunks, maybe even cross-legged by a koi pond with a cup of tea and not a care in the world. No armor, no formal posture, no seiza, just a body that had endured enough and earned the right to relax. This wasn't laziness, it was wisdom. You learn with age that control and stillness are valuable, but so is the freedom to wiggle your toes whenever you feel like it. There's an oddly beautiful rhythm to the lives of these retired warriors. They became softer but not weaker. They sat more but not idly. They had nothing left to prove, so the rituals could finally become personal again. The tea was sipped slower. The calligraphy became looser. The poetry gained warmth. Even their posture said something new, not "I am ready to fight," but "I am finally at peace." Historians have found letters and poems from retired samurai that express quiet joys watching falling leaves, petting a cat, feeling warm sunlight on tired feet. Some even joked that their proudest victory wasn't on the battlefield, but in managing to sit in a comfortable position and stay there. Without armor, without judgment, just breath and stillness and a soft breeze. One old warrior wrote of sitting on a porch in spring knees, half-bent feet, free sipping tea while the world drifted by. He said it felt like the first time he'd ever truly rested. That's something to think about. All those years of discipline, of silence, of proving something with every gesture. And in the end, the thing he treasured most was comfort. That's the great irony, isn't it? The posture that once defined strength became in retirement a memory, a muscle-etched relic. And in its place grew something gentler. A new strength, the strength to stop performing, to just be. So you sit, not in Caesar, not as a warrior, not for anyone but yourself. You lean back slightly, maybe against a smooth stone or an old wooden wall. The cicadas buzz in the distance. A breeze stirs the leaves. And for the first time in a long time, you're sitting, and it doesn't hurt. You made it. You endured. And now you get to rest. Let your shoulders soften. You're no longer in armor. You're not in a castle. You're not surrounded by rules or lords or the pressure to be perfect. You're just here, and you've done enough. The floor beneath you feels softer now. Maybe it's memory foam. Maybe it's just the feeling of release. Either way, there's no need to hold tension anymore. You've bowed, you've breathed, you've held the line through ceremony, silence, and numbness. Now your breath comes slower. Your eyes grow heavier. There's nothing to guard, nothing to analyze. You don't need to place your sword just right. You don't need to straighten your spine. The world won't collapse if you slouch just a little. You've earned this comfort, this warmth, this stillness. Maybe there's a cup of tea cooling nearby. Maybe you're under a cherry tree that's just beginning to shed its petals. Maybe the only sound is a breeze, a bird, and your own heartbeat growing quieter. You can stretch out now. You can roll onto your side. You can breathe deep and sigh long. No one is watching. No one is scoring your posture. This moment is entirely yours. And as you drift off, remember, even the most disciplined warriors learned to rest. Even the sharpest blades were sheathed. Even the proudest samurai eventually sat back, closed their eyes, and let the world soften. You're safe here. You're still. Sleep well.